We can end isolation. I don't trust anybody. I don't trust the school system in any way. Sometimes distressed students are forced into rooms alone and not allowed to leave. This is isolation. It can lead to suicidal thoughts and school refusal. Mostly, it happens to young kids aged 4 to 10. We think it needs to end. In Washington, 88% of incidents involve kids in preschool and grades K through 5. We can end isolation. Isolation is supposed to be rare, done only in emergencies, but it is used in ways it shouldn't be. For many, it has a double punch. It is harmful, and it is mostly used on kids who are most vulnerable. Homeless students are 2.8 times more likely to be isolated. Students in foster care, 7.9 times more likely. In Washington, 90% of isolated students have disabilities, and 65% are low income. We can end isolation. In Washington, isolation is also disproportionately used on Black students, who are 1.4 times more likely to be isolated than white students. In 2022 guidance, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights found no evidence that restraint or isolation are effective. It warned school districts that their use may discriminate against youth with disabilities. So far, 8 states have severely restricted isolation or banned it outright. Washington has not. Legislative efforts to phase it out, even for young kids, failed. We can end isolation. Isolation is harmful. It pushes kids further into dysregulation, causing nightmares, suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety, and PTSD. The damage lasts for years. In a state report, survivors described feelings of alienation, fear, shame, hopelessness, powerlessness, anger, and distrust. We can end isolation. Isolation leads to an escalating cycle. It is often used on the same child or small group of children repeatedly. Student is upset, acts out. Student is isolated. Student and staff experience trauma. Student has not learned how to solve their problem. Student and staff increasingly anxious for the next event. We can end isolation. But we can stop the cycle. We can end isolation in Washington. We can design schools to be accessible and inclusive. We can demonstrate to children who are diverse that they belong. We can help students identify and solve problems that are causing stress responses. We can end isolation. Children are often isolated when they have complex behavior, but that behavior is a stress response. It happens when kids have unresolved problems and cannot meet an expectation. If we get students what they need and we support kids to resolve problems, we prevent stress from escalating into crisis. We can end isolation. When we help schools shift from crisis management to crisis prevention, we can end isolation. We can end isolation. P.S. Did you know schools that have banned isolation, also called seclusion, have reported increased staff satisfaction, reduced staff turnover, and significantly lower operating costs, including workers' compensation policy costs and litigation. Ending isolation is better for staff and kids. We can end isolation. And for clarification, in federal and state law, isolation/seclusion restricts a student alone in a room or enclosure from which they may not leave. It is only legal in instances of imminent likelihood of serious harm. It does not include voluntary use of quiet space for self-calming. Restraint is using physical intervention or force to control a student. It is used in emergency situations to stop imminent harm. It is often associated with isolation because in practice, you need to restrain the child to force them into isolation.